the 7 days Freddie Mercury trained for ballet, and the upside-down performance that silenced the critics. What happens when a rock star, who's never taken a dance lesson in his life, agrees to perform ballet with the Royal Ballet in 7 days? When a man whose flexibility, by his own admission, resembles a rock decides to wear tights and leap across London's most prestigious stage in front of an audience that considers his presence an insult to high art? When someone already dismissed by punk critics as outdated chooses to double down on theatricality by attempting the most disciplined art form in existence? Freddie Mercury happened. October 1979, London Coliseum, 1 week of rehearsal that left him bleeding and crying, followed by a performance that included being held upside down while singing the most difficult notes of Bohemian Rhapsody without his voice wavering even slightly. This is the story of 7 days of torture, one night of triumph, and the moment when Britain's most conservative artistic establishment stood and applauded for 4 minutes straight, while a rock star in silver sequined tights proved that limitations exist only for people who accept them. This is also the story of how that performance introduced Freddie to the person who would hold his hand during his final breath 12 years later, and why standing upside down on the stage while singing perfectly was actually the easy part compared to what Freddie was really fighting that night. October 1979. Brian May stood in a backstage corridor at London Coliseum holding a phone receiver, his face completely drained of color. He turned slowly to Roger Taylor and whispered words that made Roger's drink nearly slip from his hand. Freddie accepted. He's performing with the Royal Ballet. Roger's laugh echoed off the corridor walls, but it wasn't amusement. It was the nervous, slightly hysterical sound of someone hearing that a friend has decided to jump off a cliff. "Has he lost his mind?" Roger said, voice rising. "Ballet." Freddie's flexibility is approximately that of a brick wall. He's going to break his own back and humiliate all of us in the process. John Deacon, usually the quiet one, couldn't even speak. Just shook his head slowly, face showing what they were all thinking. This was a disaster waiting to happen. Queen was already being dismissed as outdated by punk's rise. Their lead singer appearing on stage in tights attempting ballet would be the final nail in the coffin, the moment when critics could point and say, "See? We told you they were ridiculous." But nobody in that corridor knew why Freddie had accepted what appeared to be a suicide mission. Nobody understood what he was actually fighting, who he was trying to prove wrong, or what internal battle had made him say yes to something that seemed designed to destroy his credibility completely. To understand that decision, you have to understand where Freddie Mercury was mentally and emotionally in late 1979. The world saw him as the untouchable creator of Bohemian Rhapsody, the theatrical genius who'd conquered rock and roll. But Freddie's soul was cracking. The jazz album had been savaged by critics. Rolling Stone had called Queen boring. For Freddie, music was equivalent to breathing, and he felt like he was suffocating. His personal life offered no refuge. The romantic relationship with Mary Austin had ended, though their soul connection remained intact. Freddie once said that all his lovers asked why they couldn't replace Mary, and his answer was always the same: "Impossible. She's my only real friend." The flamboyant lifestyle, the parties, the champagne, all of it was covering for the deafening silence he faced when he came home alone at night. Freddie needed something, some challenge, some way to rebuild himself from the inside out. Then the phone call came from Wayne Eagling, his close friend and principal dancer. A charity gala was being organized. Would Freddie consider performing a dance piece? Freddie Mercury had never taken a professional dance lesson in his life. His only training was instinct and watching performers he admired. But when he hung up the phone, his eyes held a fire that had been missing for months. "They say I can't do it? Watch me." 7 days. That's all the preparation time Freddie had. To put this in perspective, ballet dancers begin training at age 5. They spend years, sometimes decades, developing the strength, flexibility, and technique required to perform professionally. Freddie Mercury was 33 years old with the flexibility of someone who'd spent his life singing, not stretching. He had 1 week to learn choreography that professionals spend months perfecting. The pressure was crushing. Imagine standing at a ballet bar on day 2 of rehearsal, surrounded by 18-year-old professionals whose bodies could bend in ways that seemed to violate physics, while your own muscles screamed with every movement. Freddie was drenched in sweat, his body literally rebelling against what was being asked of it. He turned to Wayne Eagling with his trademark humor masking genuine pain. "This is murder, darling. I have muscles in places I didn't know existed. Bones I've never heard of are aching." His toes were bleeding. Cramps seized his legs during sleep, jerking him awake in the middle of the night. When Roger and Brian visited rehearsal, they found Freddie collapsed in a corner, ice packs strapped to his legs, breathing hard, looking like someone who'd been through physical combat. "Give it up, Freddie," they said. "Nobody would blame you. This is insane." Freddie lifted his head, gave them that famous overbite smile that somehow conveyed both humor and absolute determination, and said simply, "You just handle the music. The stage is my job." The context matters here. This was 1979, when punk's aggressive, raw energy was dominating British music. Punk had positioned itself as the antidote to what it saw as rock's bloated excess and pretentious theatricality. Queen, with their operatic harmonies and elaborate productions, represented everything punk was rebelling against. Critics were already writing Queen's obituary, declaring them irrelevant in this new, stripped-down musical landscape. And Freddie's response to being called outdated and excessive? To perform ballet, the most refined, most disciplined, most traditionally elite art form in existence. It wasn't retreat. It was the most revolutionary middle finger imaginable to the idea that art should be raw and unrefined. Freddie was essentially saying, "You think we're too theatrical? You haven't seen anything yet." The 7 days of rehearsal were torture. Professional ballet requires a specific kind of strength that rock performance doesn't develop. Freddie's cardiovascular fitness was excellent from years of commanding stages, but the precise muscular control, the flexibility, the ability to hold positions that looked effortless while requiring enormous core strength, all of that had to be built from scratch in less than a week. Wayne Eagling pushed him relentlessly, not cruelly, but with the understanding that there was no room for error. Freddie would be performing with the Royal Ballet in front of London's most critical audience. Any visible struggle, any obvious gap between his ability and that of the professional dancers surrounding him would be seized upon by critics as proof that rock stars should stay in their lane. The rehearsals became a kind of physical meditation, hours of repetition, movements practiced until muscle memory took over. Freddie's body learning a completely new language, while his mind fought against the voice saying this was impossible, that he was too old, too inflexible, too unprepared to pull this off. October 7th, 1979. The night arrived with London fog pressing against the windows of the Coliseum. The London Coliseum wasn't a rock venue. It was one of Britain's most prestigious theaters, home to opera and ballet, frequented by high society and furs and jewels. The audience that night included duchesses, opera critics, and representatives of the artistic establishment who considered a rock star's presence on their stage somewhere between amusing and insulting. In the dressing room, Freddie stared at his reflection. The silver sequined outfit clung to his body like a second skin, leaving nothing to imagination. His hands shook as he adjusted the fit. Stage crew members who knew him as the Lion of Wembley, the man who could command 70,000 people with a gesture, were shocked to see him looking terrified, like a small child facing something too big to comprehend. "They're going to crucify me out there, aren't they?" he asked his assistant quietly. He took a deep breath. When he took his first step onto the stage, the orchestra fell silent. Spotlights focused on him, and the audience reaction progressed from murmur to deadly silence. Freddie Mercury was beginning the hardest test of his life, and everyone in that theater knew it. The opening bars of Bohemian Rhapsody filled the space. But Freddie wasn't just singing, he was dancing, moving among professional ballet dancers as if he'd been born on that stage. His movements weren't technically perfect in the way that 15 years of classical training would produce. But the passion, the commitment, the absolute refusal to look out of place, it was so intense that the frozen atmosphere in the theater began to melt. The audience had come expecting a spectacle in the worst sense, a rock star embarrassing himself by attempting something beyond his capability. But what they were seeing was something else entirely, A performer so committed to his art that he'd spent 7 days in physical agony to deliver something genuine rather than going through the motions. Then came the moment that would be photographed, discussed, and remembered for decades. Three principal ballet dancers grabbed Freddie by the legs and lifted him, threw him into the air, caught him, and held him completely upside down. Freddie Mercury, suspended in midair, held upside down by ballet dancers in front of London's most critical audience, began singing the most difficult passages of Bohemian Rhapsody, blood rushing to his head, gravity working against his diaphragm, every physical factor making singing harder, and his voice didn't waver, not even slightly. Perfect pitch, perfect control. The technical difficulty of what he was accomplishing was lost on most of the audience, but the musicians and singers present understood immediately. This wasn't just theatrical spectacle. This was someone demonstrating mastery over their instrument, their voice under conditions that would make most singers sound terrible. The expression on Freddie's face while suspended upside down wasn't pain or fear. It was triumph, pure, undiluted victory. He was proving something in that moment that went beyond the performance itself. He was demonstrating that limitations are negotiable, that impossible is just a word people use before someone proves them wrong. When the performance ended, the London Coliseum, a space usually defined by polite, measured appreciation, erupted. Duchesses and lords and opera critics who'd arrived with skepticism and left their seats stood. The applause wasn't the courteous golf clap of high society. It was genuine, sustained, overwhelming. 4 minutes of continuous standing ovation. Freddie stood center stage, sweat mixing with silver sequins, having just proved to Britain's most conservative artistic establishment that he wasn't just a rock star. He was an artist without boundaries, someone who could cross between genres and succeed on their terms, not just his own. But while that applause thundered through the theater, something else was happening in the wings that would change Freddie's life in ways the performance itself couldn't. In the costume department backstage, a young man named Peter Freestone was working. He was 28 years old, responsible for managing wardrobe for various productions. As Freddie came off stage, exhausted and exhilarated, their eyes met. It was brief, just a moment, a few words of conversation about costumes or logistics or something equally mundane. But Freddie saw something in Peter's eyes, a quietness, a steadiness, something that felt like the opposite of the chaos that defined most of Freddie's life. 3 weeks later, Peter Freestone received a phone call. Freddie Mercury wanted to hire him to manage Queen's tour costumes. Peter accepted. Not knowing that he'd just agreed to become the most constant presence in Freddie's life for the next 12 years. That he would be there through triumphs and struggles, through illness and decline, through everything that led to November 24th, 1991, when Peter would be one of the people in the room as Freddie took his final breath. The ballet performance didn't just give Freddie artistic vindication. It gave him Peter, the loyal friend who would stay when others left, the steady presence who never wanted anything from Freddie except to be allowed to serve him faithfully. That meeting in the costume department, facilitated by Freddie's decision to attempt the impossible, brought into his life the person who would matter most during his final days. The impact of that night extended far beyond the immediate triumph. If you watch Queen performances from 1980 onward with attention to detail, you'll see the ballet training's influence. The way Freddie moved across stages, the fluidity of his gestures, the way he used his entire body as an instrument of expression rather than just his voice. 7 days of torture at the ballet bar had given him tools he'd use for the rest of his career. But more importantly, that night healed something broken inside him. The critical dismissal that had been crushing his spirit suddenly seemed irrelevant. He just made the Royal Ballet audience, people who represented the highest standards of artistic excellence, give him a 4-minute standing ovation. What could punk critics say that mattered after that? What doubt could touch someone who'd been held upside down while singing perfectly in front of London's most demanding audience? Shortly after the ballet performance, Queen released Crazy Little Thing Called Love. It went to #1 in America, cementing Queen's global dominance at precisely the moment when critics had declared them finished. The confidence Freddie gained from proving himself in a completely different artistic arena translated directly into his music. He tested himself against the most demanding standard imaginable and succeeded. Everything else seemed manageable by comparison. But there's a question that people who know this story sometimes ask: what was the real fight? Yes, Freddie proved critics wrong. Yes, he demonstrated that rock stars could succeed in classical ballet. Yes, he showed that limitations could be exceeded with enough determination. But what was he actually fighting for during those 7 days of bleeding toes and screaming muscles? Who was he proving something to while hanging upside down singing perfect notes? Some speculate it was his father. Bomi Bulsara had very specific ideas about what constituted respectable achievement, and rock music wasn't on that list. Was Freddie performing for an audience that included, literally or metaphorically, the father who'd never quite approved of his choices? Was the upside-down performance a way of saying, I can succeed in your world of high art as well as mine? Others suggest it was about Freddie himself, about proving to the frightened immigrant boy named Farrokh Bulsara that he belonged anywhere he chose to be, that no door was closed to him, that being told you can't or you don't belong was just an invitation to prove otherwise. The ballet performance was Freddie telling himself, you can learn anything, master anything, belong anywhere if you're willing to pay the price in work, in pain, and determination. The truth is probably both and neither, probably something more complex than any single explanation can capture. But what's certain is that Freddie Mercury, at a moment when his career and confidence were both shaken, chose to do something that looked like madness, chose to attempt something that everyone around him predicted would be a disaster, chose 7 days of physical torture and public vulnerability over playing it safe. And in making that choice, in succeeding against those odds, he transformed himself, became someone who'd tested themselves against the hardest standard and passed, someone who'd looked at impossible and decided it was just another challenge to overcome. Freddie Mercury died on November 24, 1991, at age 45. But that night at the London Coliseum in October 1979, the night he performed ballet with 1 week of training, the night he hung upside down while singing perfectly, the night he received a 4-minute standing ovation from an audience that had come to watch him fail, the night he met Peter Freestone, who would become his most loyal friend that night, proved something that still resonates. It proved that fear is fuel, not barrier, that limitations are suggestions, not laws, that 7 days of dedication can accomplish what seems to require a lifetime, that being told you can't is just the universe checking how badly you want it. Freddie Mercury wanted it badly enough to bleed. And when he stood on that stage, sweat mixing with sequins, having just proven the impossible possible, he was showing everyone watching, including himself, that the only real limits are the ones we accept. Everything else is just another challenge waiting to be conquered by someone brave enough, or crazy enough, or desperate enough to try.